Today is March 25th, 1998. We're with Irving Borenstein, Borenstein. I'm Lori Fine. We're in Brooklyn, New York, the United States of America, and our language is English. Today is March 25th, 1998. We're with Irving Borenstein. I'm Lori Fine. We're in Brooklyn, New York, the United States of America, and our language is English. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Could you tell us your name with the spelling, please?
My name is Irving Borenstein, Borenstein.
What name is on your birth certificate?
Israel Borenstein.
Could you spell Israel?
Israel.
Did you ever have any other names?
In school, for a short time, they called me Isidore Borenstein. Isdore.
What is your Hebrew name, please?
Yisrael Gedalia Halevi Borenstein.
When were you born?
Long time. 9/9/24.
Could you
September 9th, 1924.
How old are you now?
73.
Where were you born?
I was born in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and from there we moved to Brownsville, Brooklyn, when I was about a month old.
Could you tell me the names of your parents and any siblings you had?
My mother's name was, in Yiddish, was Shendel Rivka, in English was Jenny Sadie Borenstein. My father was Abraham Chaim Joseph Borenstein. In Yiddish, it was Avraham Chaim Yosef Borenstein. I had one sister, her name was Miriam Borenstein, who eventually got married, and her name became Miriam Weiss.
I'd like you to describe your family, starting with your father.
My father, as much as I can remember, he's gone now 58 years. We had a grocery store, and he was a sickly man. He always coughed, even though he had served in the United States Army for a short time in the First World War. And he died at a very young age, at the age of 51. I was at that time 15 and a half.
Where was he born?
He was born in Poland. The name of the city is Tarlor, Tarlor.
What education did he have?
He had a yeshiva education, and his father was a rebbe in the town, a teacher, that is, Melamed. And that was about it that I know. However, when he came to this country, he picked up the language and spoke fluently and read English and wrote English.
How did he dress? Do you remember how his clothing looked?
Well, he used to dress for Shabbat. He would dress up in a suit and a hat and a tie. He had a mustache and a little band under his lip. That's about it. And during the week, he wore work clothes in the grocery store.
Was he involved in the community?
Well, as far as I know, he went to shul every day, and he belonged to the Chevra Kadisha of his society, and he was very much involved with that.
What comes to mind when you think of him?
He was a very generous person. I have to think very hard, but I know that at his funeral, all the people in the neighborhood came, because most of them, it was during the Depression, and he carried them on his books for years and years. And they all appreciated what he did for them. He was very big about tzedakah, and he was a good influence on his children.
Who spoke at the funeral?
At the funeral, the funeral took place from the house. There were no funeral parlors at that time, and the Rabbi Schmidman of Yeshiva Toras Chaim spoke, and I believe Rabbi Pam, the father of the rabbi of Torah Vodaas, spoke at the funeral.
Where is he buried?
He was buried in Montefiore Cemetery, the old Montefiore Cemetery.
Could you describe your mother?
My mother came to this country 7 years after my father, after the war. She was very, very Orthodox. She was surprised when she met my father. He had taken his beard off, but he had served in the army and he had to remove it. And she knew that she had a job on her hand to bring us up because my father was sickly, and she would send him to shul, to go upstairs and rest, and so on and so forth. Very good person.
What was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Paz, P-A-Z.
Where was she born?
She was born in a small town outside of Warsaw. Her name was Chepelov. Probably T-E-P-S-H-E-L-O-V. E, maybe. Love.
What do you remember about the relationship between your parents?
Well, they were very, how should I say, they're very orthodox, and they didn't show too much emotion in front of us. However, my father, when he was sick, they took him to the hospital once, and she said goodbye to him, and that was that. The second time, this last time, I had kibitz my mother. I says, they took Dad to the hospital, you didn't even kiss him goodbye. This time she kissed him goodbye, and he never came back. But and she ran, after his demise, she ran the store for about 3 years, and she couldn't do it any longer.
Where was the store?
The store was in Brownsville section of Brooklyn, Sackman Street and Liberty Avenue, 200 Sackman Street. It was the Jerusalem of New York at that time.
What special memory do you have of your mother?
She was a kind person. She helped whoever she can. She was always looking for family. I never met any grandparents because they all died before the war in Europe. I do remember my father sitting shiva for his father, made an impression upon me. But my mother's mother died during the World War, and her father died immediately after that, so I never had any recollection of them. But she always sought family. She had 4 sisters who were all killed in the Holocaust. She tried hard to bring them here. She used to go to the Hayas and try to make papers, but to no avail. They all remained there in Warsaw.
Could you describe your sister?
My sister was a very good person. She was a good student, and in those days, if you graduated high school, she took a commercial course. She went to help because my father had died, and she worked, and she was making, I think at that time it was $12 a week, which was a fortune, and she helped us financially. And eventually she married at the age of, she must have been 20 or 21. And that was it. When I was about 12 years old, I met a friend of mine from the yeshiva, and I asked him where he's going on Shabbat because all my neighbors were not Sabbath observers, and my mother wanted me to be more towards Sabbath observing. And he said he's going to a new organization he heard of, which was known at that time as the Shoma Hadati. Today it's known as the Bnei Akiva. And he talked me into going with him. And there I met, actually I can say it was the future of my life. I met a young man by the name of Moshe Weiss, who was the Menahel, and he influenced me a lot. And as a matter of fact, he started to teach me for my bar mitzvah. And he came to my house, and I realized he noticed my sister, and eventually he married her, and he became known as Rabbi Moshe Weiss, and they had 5 children. They're all well known. One is Rabbi Avi Weiss, and one is Rabbi Mordechai Weiss, the Rosh Yeshiva in Margate, and the older daughter is Tova Weiss Reich, who was married to Walter Reich, who was the director of the Holocaust Museum in Washington until recently. He didn't want to let Arafat in. He said he's no, and so on, and that ended his career as far as the museum was concerned, which annoys us quite a bit. She has one daughter in Jerusalem, sorry, and one son who is a psychologist in Toronto, Canada.
What's your earliest memory?
My earliest memory would be when I started to go to yeshiva. I went very early, at the age of 5.
Where did you go?
I went to Chaim Berlin for 3 years, and after that they transferred me to Torres Chaim in East New York. And that is the memory of my schooling and so on and so forth.
Do you remember what languages were spoken in your home?
Yes, we spoke Yiddish. I spoke Yiddish until the age of about 3, and then when I went on the outside, I started to speak English. However, Yiddish was the main language. When my mother didn't want me to understand, she spoke to my father in Polish, which I really never mastered.
What do you remember about the community where you grew up?
Community I grew up where we had a Jewish element. We also had a Polish and Russian element. There was a Ukrainian club, I remember, on Gunmore Avenue, a block away from us. And also we had shuls on Christopher Street, which was a block, and another one on Gunmore Avenue. My father went to both shuls, but on Shabbat he went to the Landslide Shul on Sutter Avenue. My father took me to shul every Shabbat, so.
Who were your friends from childhood?
Well, I had friends that were not Orthodox Jewish boys, and as a child I resented their going to school from 9 to 3, and I had to go at that time it was 8:30 to 6:30. Sundays I had to go a full day. That's why my father eventually sent me to a more modern yeshiva where Sunday was a half a day in Torah Chaim. I remember losing a friend. It was Erev Shavuos from an Orthodox family. He fell out the window on the 4th floor. It was a hot day and he was sitting on the window. I never forgot that. His name was Chatzi. We called him Chatzi Katzen. That made an impression upon me. That was probably the first death I came in touch with. But that was the memory. Then I switched over to the Orthodox element in the Shoma Hadati. And that was about it.
Do you remember your bar mitzvah?
Oh yes, vividly. My bar mitzvah was in the shul in Sutter Avenue, my father's chavra.
What was his name?
The name of the shul was Ahavas Yisrael Anshe Tala, Love of Israel, People of Tala. And my father was active there, and I learned the Haftorah and the Mafta. In those days we didn't learn the whole Seder. I learned the Mafta and the Haftorah. And it was a unique Seder. As I went on in life, I realized that it was a Seder of Kiseitze, Mamulchoma. When you go out to fight a war and you meet someone that you will fall in love with, even though it's, in that case, they refer to a non-Jew. And also, the Mafta was Zochar, which is the remembrance of Amalek. And I often thought about it, that it might have been my destiny to go overseas eventually and meet my mate and also see what the Amalek did to our people.
Who was your best friend growing up?
Well, after I joined the Shoma Hadati, I had a friend, his name was Jack Levine. He was my best friend.
How'd you spend time together?
We spent every Shabbos together. He came to my house, I went to his house. Eventually he moved away from Brooklyn to the first project that was built in Williamsburg. And I used to visit him. I used to walk there on Shabbos. And his sister became my sister's best friend. They were all part of the group. As a matter of fact, we were friends. He became my partner. He was my partner for about 3 years in my business. Then he decided to move to California. And that was it. He is now deceased, unfortunately.
What was the address of your home?
200 Sackman Street.
Can you describe the apartment?
Well, we had a grocery store. And we lived in 2 rooms behind the store until the age of about 6. I remember it vividly. Then we could afford a 4-room apartment on the first floor above the store. It was a 20-family house. And I used to admire the landlord coming in every month and taking money for the rent of the store. And I said, when I grow up, I'm going to be a landlord. And that was about it. We had the bathtub in the kitchen. And we had no steam in the beginning. Then when they put in steam, it was, we were modern.
Could you describe Shabbos in your home?
Shabbos was a very eventful affair. We we dressed for Shabbos. We had to take a bath on Friday. My mother used to make fish Thursday night behind the store, and cook up a meal, chicken soup and all the rice and soup or whatever went with it. And we came home from shul Friday evening. My father made kiddush, and I had to make kiddush, and we sang Zmirot, all different songs between the fish and the soup.
Do you remember any of the Zemiros?
Oh yes, I sang them at our table, and my children sing it, but my voice is not.
Try one.
It would be, we sang Mizmor with David, the voice.
A little bit.
It's going to rain outside. Mizmor with David. I'm hoarse now. I'll take some water now. Mizmor with David. I can't do it. It's too heavy.
What else did you eat? What else did you eat for Shabbos?
Well, we had on Shabbos we had cholent.
What was in your cholent?
It was a Polish cholent, so it was different. We had potatoes and soup and a big piece of meat, and my mouth is watering now because I'm a vegetarian, and that's about it.
What did you talk about at the table?
Well, it was the Shabbos. The Shabbos itself was Fahir time. My father used to listen to me how much Chumash I learned during the week, and if I knew my Chumash, I was rewarded, and if I didn't, I had to go back and study some more.
What was the reward?
Reward, one day my sister took me to circus. We had a local circus, and or I could go to the movies on Friday afternoon, and things like that. For Hanukkah, we got gifts, very small gifts, but I remember my father buying us pencil sets or whatever it be, whatever we could afford.
How'd you celebrate Purim?
Purim was not a big deal in those days for some reason. We used to sing Heintis Purim, Morgen Zois, Git Ma Penny, and Vaf Ma Rois. He used to, I remember this vividly, he gave me Shalach Monas. I should take the Rabbi Pam, who was his rabbi, who lived on Sackman Street, and I used to be happy about it and dread it because I knew he's going to listen to what I learned. And I used to come into the house. He was very gracious. He sat me on his knee, and he'd listen to what I didn't know and what I did know, and that was about it. But that was Purim. Hanukkah, we got gifts. I remember my first gift. He bought me a little set of checkers, which was a big deal in those days. And also on Sukkot, I remember going to our neighbor for a sukkah until I was old enough, at about 12, to help my father put up a sukkah in our backyard, which we did. In those days there was no bamboo. We had to go to Canarsie. We cut the schach, we put it on a horse and wagon, we brought it home. And that was it.
What do you remember about Pesach?
Pesach was a very tiring time for my father because he had the grocery store, and my mother was very medoptic, and my father was, and we had to make half the store Pesach, and no one could dare go over there with any bread. And this happened 2 weeks before, and he used to take orders and then deliver them, and we had all the landskite would come to give us the Pesach order, and we had a car that came and delivered the orders. We were up the night before Pesach. To get all the orders out, we were up practically all night. It was a hectic time.
Where did you get matzah?
We had Horowitz Margaret. There was no such thing as the hand shmur in those days. We had Horowitz Margaret and Manischewitz and Streitz and Goodman's. I remember the matzahs we used then.
What wine did you use?
At that time, my mother made wine in the basement. We had a wooden casket. She used to go out to the market and buy baskets of grapes way before Pesach, and she made her own wine, and she made her own schmaltz. I remember the chickens she used to bring into the house, and she made grieben, if you know what that grieben is. Probably clogged my arteries, and that was about it.
Who were your neighbors?
Our immediate neighbor there was an ironworks, then two partners, Mitnick and Meister. As a matter of fact, his daughter, my sister's friend, lives around here now. She's a school teacher. I still see her. And then we had Nelik, who was a candy store man across the street, and Novak, who had the drugstore, which I'll tell you a funny story about him. And we had Hauptfinger, who had a hardware store across the street from us, who was a frum one, and he put up the sukkahs and everything. Now we went to his Einik was Rabbi Avram Halfinger today in Massachusetts. We went to the yeshiva. I was to his bus. I remember him very well.
Do you have a radio?
We were one of the first with a radio on the block. Con Edison at that time had a premium for $24. You got a toaster, a radio, and a floor lamp. And you paid it out over a year period. And my father went out and bought the deal. Con Edison at that time had an office on Pitkin Avenue and Bristol Street, bringing back memories. And people used to come in and listen. We had Jewish shows in the evening. They had the Bronzeville Zeta, Ennie and Benny, and some other Jewish shows, which were very interesting. And I understood Yiddish, so and of course, when my father and mother were not at the radio, I listened to the Lone Ranger and to the Shadow. Who knows? And then, there was no TV, and my father said, I remember, someday there will be a box, you'll be able to look into it and see it. From the radio, you'll see who's talking. And we were one of the few people who had a phone.
Who did you speak to?
Whoever called. You know, my mother and father mostly. Not everybody had a phone. The big deal was the phone in the candy store, and I used to hang out there. If the phone rang, someone got a phone, I'd run up and get them, and they'd give me 2 cents for calling them, and so forth. That was the phone. And the drugstore had 2 telephone booths that you had to stand up. They had wooden booths you close up. And on top of that, he had packages of napkins or whatever, sanitary napkins. That's what he had, stocked to the roof. And I thought he was diagonally across my store, and I was older already. I must have been 14 or 15. I thought, on April Fool's Day, I have to call him up. And I called him up and I said, this is a New York telephone company. We decided to give you 2 modern boots. They will be there in about 3 hours. Can you have everything ready? And he was so happy. He got the ladder, he went up, he took everything off. And when I noticed everything was done, I called him back and told him of the mistake we made. It wasn't him, it was Nellick. He was Novak. And then I came back and I asked him what happened. He told me the story. Oh my God, you should be angry with him. Eventually he found out, but he took it as a gentleman. I told him my father was incensed. He said, how could you do that? I said, it's April Fool's Day. And that was one of my first practical jokes.
What newspapers were read in your home?
Well, we read the news. Then eventually the Post came out, where if you buy the Post, a series of coupons, you'll get the Webster's Dictionary and all the works of Charles Dickens. And my sister said, we're going to start buying the Post. And that's what we did, and we have the sets. I have the dictionary. She had the Dickens, I believe.
In growing up, as you got older, do you remember any people coming from Germany? As Hitler had come to power.
I remember people coming into the store, yes. And my mother had Rachmanis on them. They were selling stockings, nylon or silk. I think it was silk stockings in those days. To make a living, the refugees and this and that. My mother used to buy a pair even if she didn't need it. I certainly remember them. And eventually in the Shoma Hadati, I got to know many of them. One was, may he rest in peace, Yitzchak Goldschmidt, who was killed in action. I have the last letter from him. And that was my experience with the Germans.
Did they tell you anything of what they had seen before they had left Germany?
Well, as a child, they told me that the Germans were disrupting their life. They couldn't go to school. They took away their businesses and things like that. And of course, I was being indoctrinated in the Shoma Hadaki about Zionism and so on, and what anti-Semitism is and so forth. And it made quite an impression upon me. And that was my background after that, my foundation in life.
As a teenager, what were your plans for the future?
Well, I was a poor yeshiva student, so I went to Havana High School. I wanted to be an electrical engineer, and I was taking a course in electricity. My father died in 1940. My mother could not run the store herself. I was not quite 16, even though you need had to be 16 to get working papers. Somehow she talked me out of going to, she says, you're going to go to school, you're sitting without a yarmulke, you'll be better off being a businessman, and so on and so forth. And she talked me into taking over the running of the store with her. It's funny, and I told her the only way I would be in the store if she would upgrade the store and make it modern, and she did. She took money, which today I wonder how she did it, and we modernized the whole store. And that was in 1940, 41. But when the war broke out in 41, I was just about 17 and a half. I was very heavy. I must have weighed about 269 pounds at that time. And I decided I want to be a pilot. And I went to volunteer. You could still volunteer, but I needed my mother's signature. So I went to the recruiting place, and they told me, you're too heavy. We don't even have a plane that'll hold you. And I was so incensed that I went on a diet. And I lost 100 pounds that first year. When I eventually went away, I was 169. My mother saw that I haven't got the sitzfleisch to be in the business. She decided to sell the store. She sold the store. Our store was Shomer Shabbos for 18 years. We had that store. When I was 18, she decided to sell the store. She sold it to someone, took a $300 deposit, and realized that he's not Shomer Shabbos, and she could not stand the idea that that store would not be Shomer Shabbos. She refused to give him title. She was penalized. She had to double the balance. She lost $300. And about 3 months later, she found someone who was Shomer Shabbos. His name is Weinberg. And she sold it to him. As a matter of fact, his son now davens with my son in Springfield, New Jersey. And she was very much satisfied. But for years, she went to the neighborhood to collect all the monies that my father had lent to people, 50 cents, $1, but she had it in a book and she collected till 20 years later, maybe 18 years to be exact. And I had decided that at 18 that I'm going to go to the Army. But by that time, they had stopped people from volunteering because people were volunteering into these services that were not needed. So I had to wait to be drafted. My sister and my brother-in-law, who was a rabbi in Monticello at that time, lived in Monticello. And I went to work in the Hachshara for Shom Hadati. I was with them. And my mother one day decided to move to my sister. She gave up the home. And I moved in with them, and I was drafted from Monticello. And I went to the Army from Monticello.
That's the end of the tape.
Okay.
Through. We're with Irving Borenstein, and it's March 25th, 1998. Were you aware of any communal organizations actively involved with the war?
Well, I know about the Aguda who sponsored the Hatzalah movement. As a matter of fact, eventually I got to know Mike Tress, who was very active, one of the founders of the Hatzalah movement. But at the age of 17 and 18, I had different things on my mind, and it made an impression upon me. I remember when the Germans first, the Nazis came in 1934, 35, it must have been, the yeshivas had proclaimed a fast day. I remember marching down Pitkin Avenue, protesting what they're doing to the Jews. At that time it was only Germany. No other Jews were involved, but it quieted down, and I was active in the Shom Hadati. I was going to the Mosheva every year, and as a matter of fact, I helped build the Mosheva in Livingston Manor, which was one of our first. I helped put up a cheder ochel, they call that, because I was mechanically inclined and very in building and all that. At that time, I was 17.
Could you describe Mike Tress? Could you describe Mike Tress?
Well, I met him later on. Mike Tress lived in Bedford Avenue, and this came much later after I came back from the Army. I had the store on Lee Avenue, which is a block away from Bedford, runs parallel to it. And I met him coming into the store. His sister was married to someone that I did business with. Trying to think of his name. He was in the nylon business, stocking business.
Yeah.
And so on. Otherwise, we didn't have too much of a relationship. Later on, when I read about him, I realized who he was. Matter of fact, there was a rabbi who was very active in the Saba. He was with the Mary Yeshiva. I forget his name.
Rabbi Cutler? Rabbi Cutler.
Not Cutler. No, Cutler was with the Lakewood Yeshiva. I got a letter.
Mir- Kalmanowitz?
Kalmanowitz. I knew Rabbi Kalmanowitz. He was a dynamic personality. I got a letter from the Rebbetzin Cutler, which I have somewhere in my archives, thanking me for finding one of her family. That was later on in Germany when I was in the army. That's about the Aguda was to the right of the organization which I belonged to, which was Shoma Hadati, which was part of the Hapol Mizrahi. We were the younger branch of it. I eventually became a Rosh Ken, the head of the Brownsville Ken, and I organized it, and I was with them until we went to until I went to the army.
When did you go?
I went to the army in 1943. I believe it was July 24th, 1943. I left for the army from Monticello. I went up to Binghamton, where we were sworn in, taken to Camp Upton. I was there a week, and from there I was assigned to Camp Edwards, the 133rd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Gun Battalion. At first I was with A Battery, and then I was transferred to Headquarter Battery of the 133rd.
How long was your basic training?
Well, we didn't have basic training per se as the infantry has, and then shipped to an outfit. We trained with the outfit continuously. Each battery had 4 90-millimeter guns. We had what is known as a Mickey Mouse radar unit, and we also had a telescope, which was a height finder, which told us the height of the plane, figured how long it would take for the projectile. Once it left the 90-millimeter gun, cut the head of the projectile so on contact it would hit the plane. Knew where the plane would be at that time.
What was your rank when you began in the Army?
Private,
And when you finished?
PFC. I made one bundle.
What unit were you assigned to?
United States Army Anti-Aircraft Battalion.
What was your serial number?
329-39305. I still have my dog tags with the number on it. That was me.
Did you have any specialty training besides this?
Well, in the Army, I was known as a utility repairman. I remember the number 121. But eventually, they sent me, when the outfit I was in went to Fort Bragg, they had found out that our 90-millimeter guns, besides being a good anti-aircraft gun, was to be mounted on a tank, because we did not have a large enough gun. The Germans had the 88s. So they sent us to Fort Bragg, where we took training in half-tracks and tanks. At Fort Bragg, they sent me to Fort Fisher. I think it was a 6-week course, a machine gun.
Where was this?
Fort Fisher, North Carolina. And after we completed that, I was certified as a machine gun repairman and so on and so forth.
What were you
Before
told?
that, I had, it was rough for me to become involved with Gentile people, because all my life I was shielded. And I met my first anti-Semite, I think it was in Camp Edwards at the table. We were eating and they had butter, and I grabbed the butter before him, and he just said, just like a Jew. The table went over. I was husky and heavy. I had worked out for years, and he never said it again. However, I realized that the first sergeant didn't care for me either, and I had decided I want to be a pilot anyway. So I applied for Air Cadet. The United States Air Force at that time was part of the Army, the Army Air Force, and I applied for the Air Cadet. I took the exams, and I passed, and I was sent to Greensboro, North Carolina. I think it was the University of Greensboro to train for cadet training. I was there about 3 months. I took all the preliminary courses and everything when the Pentagon decided they did not need any pilots any longer. My original outfit was known, the 133rd was slated to go overseas, and they requested that I be sent back, and I was sent back to the old outfit. And I went overseas with them.
What were you told about the Nazis during your training?
Well, the first impression I had is when I walked in, I saw the sign that said, "Kill or be killed." And that was my first indoctrination in using guns and knowing what it was. The enemy at that time was not only the Nazis, there was the Japanese, and we didn't know where we were going to go, so they didn't focus on Nazis. It was Germany and Japan, actually. That was our basic training.
While still in the United States, did you see any signs of war? Any changes here?
Well, the rationing.
What was rationed?
Well, gasoline was rationed, sugar was rationed, if I remember correctly. I don't remember meat being rationed, not while I was there. And they got stamps for gas and so on and so forth. Although I was not really involved in that, being in the Army.
Were you able to maintain an Orthodox lifestyle in the American Army?
In the Army, I put my filling on every day. I remember one day the captain came in. I remember his name even. He was captain of A Battery. I was still with A Battery. His name was Carmino Garcia. I had my filling on. I didn't have him with a towel, so I wasn't married. And the sergeant yelled attention, and I was in the corner davening. And he asked the sergeant, "What is that man doing?" He saw my hand strapped and my head filling. Said, "The man is praying." He said, "No one shall disturb that man while he's praying." I was really proud of that man, and I liked him. And that was my, and I got to know the chaplains and so on. My first furlough, I remember like today, to go see my mother and brother-in-law, Monticello. I had a choice of going on Rosh Hashanah, which fell, I think it was on a Saturday and Sunday. So the pass was for me to go on Friday afternoon. No, it was the other one. It was Friday and Saturday. It came out a 3-day holiday somehow. Or it was Thursday and Friday, and Saturday I would have to come back. And I told the captain I need another day because I prefer not to travel. My mother wouldn't be able to take it. So he says, "Well, no, we can't do that for you." So I took Yom Kippur, which was 1 day instead of the 2 days. That I remember. That's the only time I had any religious problems with him.
Were there any other Jewish soldiers with you?
We had yes, my outfit had quite a few. I had Klein, I remember, and Kaplan, Adler, Remo Adler. He was with me until the day I got hurt in the Army.
Were there any, I'm sorry. Were there any other Orthodox soldiers with you?
Not in this outfit, no. None at all. I went to services in Camp Edwards. The chaplain, I forget his name, but we had services in Camp Edwards.
Was there any choice for you? Could you have avoided the draft?
I could have gone back to the yeshiva and gotten a 4D, but I refused to. My mother took me to her Rebbe. My mother had Rebbe Epstein, and she took me to him, and I told him it's a Muhammad's mitzvah, they're killing Jews, I have to go when they take me. And I wanted to volunteer, and she didn't want to sign at that time. Now I'll have to go where they take me. And he just wished me good luck, and he told her there's nothing he can really do.
When you left home, besides your tefillin, were there any other Jewish articles that you had taken with you?
I had my Abba Compass with me, which I wore every day. And when I was questioned by, he was a nice fellow, a Catholic young man, who had a rosary beads, I explained to him, Mahavdil, this is mine, you have your rosary beads, and that's it. Good luck. And I told my grandchildren, and it happens to be a fact, the day that I was hurt, I did not have my Abba Compass on. It's a story that my whole family knows, in amazement. And that was it.
When did you go to Europe?
I went to Europe, D-Day was June 6th, I believe, 1944, and I landed in England, it was D plus about 20, sometime in July. We now landed in Liverpool, and we were stationed in Macclesfield for about a week until our equipment came, and then we were sent over. I went over to France in an LST. We landed in Normandy, and I think it was Omaha Beach where we landed, and it opened up, and we drove onto the beach. By that time, the Allies were in St. Lo. They had already cleared the beaches. We set up our guns, and they were marching towards Paris. This was in July, or the end of July, and I was with the outfit until September. We had not showered, and we went for showers. I remember I drove a truck at that time, and we took the men to the showers, and I got hurt. Something happened. When I woke up, I was in England in a hospital already. I'd been unconscious. That was in September between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I never knew what happened until many years later. I was taking my wife to give birth to my son, my second son, Avi, when a fellow by the name of Wolf saw me on Avenue U with my wife. I was in the car, and he started yelling, "Borenstein, Borenstein, you're alive." I said, "Wolf, what are you doing?" He says, "I picked you up, you were bleeding like a pig, and I brought you to the evacuation hospital, and I left you, and I never knew if you survived or not." I said, "What do you do?" "I have to take my wife to the hospital." "What do you do?" He says, "I have a seltzer out now." I says, "I gave my address, you're my seltzer man." And he was my seltzer man for years after that. And he brought friends back. He told me what happened at that time. That's how I found out what happened. After I was hurt, I was in England in the hospital for about, that was September, October, November, and then I was supposed to be ZI'd. I was supposed to be sent back to the Zone of Interior, but the Battle of Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Army decided to take limited service, make me a limited service man, and take men out and put them into active service. And I was reassigned to the United States Signal Corps, and I went to the American School in Swindon, and they trained me for the signal, and I was sent overseas again. And I went to, by that time the Americans had gone to Bonn. They're just about to cross the Rhine River, and I followed with them. I had a relapse. I was sent back to the hospital in Paris. I stayed there about 2 weeks, and I said, I want to go back. I want to see what happened. So I was reassigned. This time I was reassigned to the Air Force, and I spent the rest of my Army time with the Army Air Force. There I followed them. I met the first Jews that had been in camps in Paris. I met my cousin. As a matter of fact, I gave him one of my blankets, and he made a coat out of it. It was his first warm coat. But I started following and looking for Jews. I remember being in Schweinfurt. We were stationed there, and then all of a sudden we were sent to the SS Kaserne in Freimann, which was right outside of Munich. That was the end of May. The war had just ended. The war ended May 8th, I believe. And I had been sent to the SS Kaserne. We should work there and set up our guns and do what we can. I went looking for Jews. And I'll never forget my first vision of a Jew pushing a pushcar with bread, and I asked him in Yiddish, well, what's this do? And he told me his English. I was 19 and a half, and I became a man of 50. I got old when I went in. He took me in by the hand. He pulled me, B'Stayid Americana. He was so happy to see me. Pulled me into this DP camp, which was in the Funkkaserne. They called it the Funkkaserne in Freimann. And it was there that I started to visit the people. And it was there that I met my wife. I met her. She was in a room with 4 or 5 other girls. And somehow she attracted me. And I said to my buddy, that little dark-haired girl, she's mine. He says, you're crazy. He really got hit in the head. When I was wounded, I had a fractured skull, a broken jaw, a ruptured kidney, and a broken arm. So I was in a pretty bad state, but thank God I got better. And I spoke to her. I remember I had confiscated a bicycle, and I took her on a handlebar, and I took her for a ride. I had known her 3 days, and I proposed to her. And she jumped off the bike. She said, you're making fun of me because I'm a poor refugee and so on. No. And she started crying. I had my hands full. And I convinced her, and I saw her, and I went with her, and I rode home. And I remember my brother-in-law's father was a Rebbe, wrote to me. He says, come home. You're not sure what she is, what family or anything. Think about it, then you can always go back and meet her. And there was pressure from my family, and I thought maybe they're right. And I started getting dizzy again. All my pains came back, and I was sent back to the hospital in Paris, and they had made arrangements to send me home, and I told them no. And I went back, and I put in to marry my wife, and the captain really thought I was nuts. So he made arrangements for me to be shipped away from Munich to Frankfurt. When I arrived in Frankfurt, I volunteered to be charge of quarters, and I sat a whole night, and I was waiting because requests were coming in. This was a reception center, and the charge of quarters would reassign the soldiers to different outfits, and the request came in for an outfit right next door to the outfit I had been with in Munich, and sure enough, I put my name down. The next morning I was packed, and I went back to Munich, and I found her again. The outfit I joined then was, once again, the Air Force, and we shipped out from there to Salzburg. And I lost contact with my wife. I went back looking for her. I couldn't find her. And in the interim, I remembered she told me she has a father in London who had escaped before the war. And she didn't know if he's alive. He didn't know she was alive. She had no contact. She has an aunt in Cleveland. So I had lots of time coming to me. So I put in for a furlough to London. I should look for her father. In this outfit I was with, there was a Sergeant, Saul Wexler, who was Orthodox. And I talked him into taking the trip with me, and we flew into London from Salzburg. He went to the library in London. I went looking for her. He was married, and I went looking for her father. I went to the Czech embassy. They had no record of him. Finally, I went to the Aguda. I figured he's a religious man and so on. And a man there said he knows of an old man living in an old bombed-out house. I remember the number, 7 Dunk Street. It was N16, London. And he believes he might be the man because he's always crying about the daughter and wife that he left in this town in Czechoslovakia. And when I came in, I spoke with him. I remember the man was crying, the man with a beard and payers. And he thanked me, and he wanted to give me money. I said, she doesn't need money. And I gave him a picture of his daughter, and he then gave me the addresses of her 2 sisters and brother who had survived. They were living in Belgium, and 1 sister in France. After I left him, I had his address. I flew back to Salzburg. I'll tell you a nice story about the flight back. Saul was a very pious fellow. We were on a plane, and the landing gear would not come down to Salzburg. It had snowed there, and the pilot, his name was Pope, Lieutenant Pope. He was a fighter pilot originally, but this was a cargo plane. He said, well, fellas, we're going to have to belly walk it. To me, it was an exciting experience. To Saul, who was older than me and married, he started saying, Tilton. I said, Saul, come on, we're going to make it. And we belly walked, we landed in Baruch Hashem, nothing happened to us. And I went back to Munich looking for my girlfriend, who was now my wife, and I couldn't find her until a young man recognized me. He says, I know who you're looking for, the little Schwarzer girl. She lives in 35 Barerstrasse. I went in there. When I got there, she saw me, and I gave her her father's picture, and she fainted on me. and we revived her. And I said to her, "You can't stay here. We're being shipped to Firth, and they're making a new camp there, and I will make arrangements that you have your own home there." And we came to Firth. I brought her there, and she had her own house, but she didn't want to be alone. She told me of a friend who is in Fehrenwald, in Wolfertshaus in Germany, who saved her life. And I made up my mind to get her. I went after her.
Who was that?
Her name was Sarah Schaefer. At that time, while I was there, I met the Kosenberger Rebbe, and I met his gabbai. I took him with the Jeep for a ride. His name was Mordechai Leib Tiernauer, who eventually became a Satmar, but that was later on when the Kosenberger moved to Williamsburg.
Did you talk to the Kosenberger?
I spoke with the Kosenberger, and he was the one man that I admired, for he was setting up yeshivas. He was taking care of the kids. He was not looking to do business. Everyone else was doing business. He was not looking for it. He was trying to save whatever the remnants were, and he did a terrific job. The man was a tzaddik.
When did you first learn about the concentration camps?
In France. I didn't know to what extent, because the camps in France were labor camps. I heard of Dachau, but the first true camps I learned when we went over the Rhine. The Germans themselves, the civilians were talking about it, and I met many Polish people that came from Poland to work for Germany. They were telling me about how they killed them. That's when I made up my mind I must find them. I could have gone home, but I refused.
What did they tell you? What information did they give over to you at that time?
At that time, they told me about the ghettos, about the taking of the Jews. They did not mention the crematories. And this I found out when I came to Funkasen. As a matter of fact, I had an interesting episode. I always carried a 45 on me. I felt I wanted to be, although it was an officer's gun, somehow I had permission to carry it. And I had my own 45 and I carried it. And I came into this S-Saal, dining room, in Freimann, this was. And I saw two Jews jump off the table and grab someone, and they started beating him. They wanted to kill him. And I stopped them. I said, "What's going on here?" And he said, "This man was a capo." And the woman came in crying, "He gave my children away." I didn't have the heart to intervene any longer. I just take them, and I never know what happened to the man. I do not know to this day what happened to the man. So that was one of the incidents. Later on in Firth, I tried to organize them to speak with the people. When I was in England, I made contact with the chief rabbis, emergency council, and I spoke in the shul there, and I told them what I found. They wanted to know what happened. I told them these are people that lost everything besides their families. They lost all their Yiddishkeit. They don't have a chalaf. They don't have anything. And they promised me they will send me tefillin and chalafim, and I brought back some. And when I went back to Firth, they were true to their word. And in Firth, I met a man, his name was Orlander, Oizer Orlander, who was a shochet. And when I brought him the first chalafim, he started to make kosher meat, and the people started to eat kosher again. And eventually, we built the first mikveh in Firth. And the Rabbi Shapiro, his name was, Rabbi Spiro, who was a rabbi, he was liberated, and he remained in Firth as the rabbi of Firth for the rest of his life. However, his brother was a chaplain in the United States Army, and when he heard he was alive, he came to Firth to see him. Firth originally was a Jewish town. I think Kissinger came from there. I went to visit their shul in Firth, and on the wall, I saw the record of the German Jews that fought in the First World War, what they did for the Germany, for the Kaiser. All their names were up and so on. The Germans somehow did not destroy that shul in Firth.
Did you ever enter a concentration camp?
Yes.
When was this?
The first camp I actually entered was Mauthausen.
When was this?
That was before I went to England. My mother had sent me a letter that my cousin somehow contacted her and that he was in Mauthausen. He was, so I decided to go to Mauthausen. Mauthausen at that time was on the other side of the Danube, and the Russians had occupied that side. But I made up my mind I'm going. I crossed the Danube. The Russians respected me, and I told them that I went into Mauthausen. I looked for him. I'll never forget what I saw there. The steps, the crematories. The Jews had built a flight of steps. It was to go up there. I found his documents, but he had left. I have another cousin who had been in Israel, who was in the Jewish brigade, and he got to Mauthausen and found him first and took him to Italy.
What were the names? The names of these cousins?
Joseph Grunberg was my cousin from Israel, and his name was Chaskel Dresner, who lives today in Tel Aviv. Joseph Grunberg was a volunteer in the British brigade, and he came to Mauthausen, brought him to Italy, took off his clothes, gave it to him, and he returned to Israel as Joseph Grunberg. And that's how he got into Israel. I never met him until I came to Tel Aviv many years later. Grunberg I met, he came to America right after the war.
Were people still living in Mauthausen when you got there?
There were a few people there, but most of them had, there were two camps, Mauthausen and Gunskirchen. Mauthausen, the people of Mauthausen, many of them had typhus. They took them to Linz. In Linz, I was stationed there for a while too, in Hersching. Hersching was the name on the Fluchtplatz. This was all in between before I went back to England for the visit, maybe a week or two, but I remember it comes back to me. In Linz, I met many Jews too that had been in the camps. Their stories were all the same. I want you to know, most of the survivors that I met, there were quite a few from Lithuania, Poland, many of them were from Romania, in Linz in the hospital, and many of them were Carpathian Jews. They were brought in later to the camps. I guess that's why they survived. The stories were gruesome. You cannot believe what you hear. It's hard. And of course I have pictures which I took, which I saw, and so on and so forth. That was it.
What were the conditions of the survivors when you saw them? If we're going to change tapes.
Okay.
Group 3 with Irving Borenstein, and it's March 25th, 1998.
While I was in the camps, I also visited a camp in Landsberg, where I met a sister of a friend that I knew in the United States. He sent me a letter to find his sister, and I found her.
What was her name?
Ninauto. His name was Ninauto. She was Polish. She had been shot and left for dead and somehow survived and ended up in the camps. She was liberated by the American forces, also on a march probably from Landsberg or any other place. I also visited Felderfink and Fernwald, and there was a dedication of a new shul in Bad Nauheim that I attended that had been rebuilt. And I also visited Salzheim, which was in Frankfurt. At the time I was there, it was immediately after the camp. There was no fraternization between American soldiers and the Germans. As a matter of fact, I had a special permit to be allowed to walk the streets with my girlfriend or wife. And I got picked up once because the MP did not believe it, and he took me and my wife in Munich, and the captain in charge, he apologized. He laced into the MP for not knowing how to read, actually. He saw the permit and so on. I don't know if it was an anti-Semitic act or whatever it been, but that was the result. I did not have too much to do with the German population. Just whenever, in the beginning, it was very easy for me. My wife didn't have a watch. I I took a watch away from one of the women. I said, yeah, that must be a Jewish watch. She said, no, no, no. I said, well, it is now. And I gave it to my wife. I'll never forget, that was the first watch, I think it was the first watch she ever had. It was an Omega. And also a bicycle that I had mentioned before that I procured. I also had a car. We had to report to the military government whenever we did anything with the Germans, which I did. However, I was known as being a GI that spent most of his time with the refugees, any time off. I had a good rapport with them. When we went forward for Hanukkah, I organized a Hanukkah concert for them. They had talented people. They had one that had been in the Warsaw theatrical business, and we put together a beautiful show. And I felt that these people deserved something they haven't had in a long time, and somehow I procured ice cream for them from the American Red Cross. And as a matter of fact, I have an article in the Post that describes the affair. And I paid, and we got them the ice cream. They called it lettuce. That's the Jewish word. And they had a terrific time.
What was the role of the Red Cross in the rescue efforts?
I never came across them. Mostly I came across the UNRWA and the Joint Distribution Committee.
Did you come across the Bad Hatzalah?
Bad Hatzalah, I never came across, no. The Joint did a terrific job, as far as I remember. We also had occasion, people doing business there, as everybody knows. They were selling, they were buying. And when I started getting the kosher foods from England, I made sure that I gave it only to people who ate kosher. There was a big protest. Came to me running, how come you doing that? We're people too. I said, you're selling it. You're not eating it. And I showed him where, and he certainly, as a matter of fact, for that Hanukkah that I spoke about, I made a campaign amongst my fellow GIs to donate candy for Hanukkah. I said it's the Jewish Christmas, but that was the only way I could explain. And I got a load of chocolate bars, and we gave it out at that Hanukkah evening. Immediately, in January 10th, 1946, I was married by the Burgermeister. I took along my sergeant and my wife, and he wanted to kiss the bride. She looked at him, but that was their customs. And the mayor, I said, no, you don't kiss. She doesn't need a kiss from a German. She was kissed enough. And that was it. I came back to the barracks. I only married her legally so I can bring her to the States. I wanted my mother to witness the chuppah. I was an only son, and she had never. So after the wedding, I came home to the barracks, and the captain says to me, Bornstein, didn't you get married today? I said, yes. He says, so what are you doing here? I says, well, I explained. He says, come on, you must have got paid off to bring it to the States. And he sent me on a trip. He said, if that's the way you feel, I'm sending you away. All right. Meanwhile, I had put in for transportation for my wife to the United States, and the orders came through. I still have copies of them, ordering her to go to her sister in Brussels, whom I had gotten the address from her father, and I was given a 2-week furlough, and I took her to Brussels.
Could you tell us your wife's name?
Miriam, my wife Miriam, Borenstein. At that time it was Hoffman, and I took her to Brussels, and I met her sister, Rachel. Her second name was Koznicki at that time, and they told me a weird story, how they had survived in Brussels. They were put in between two walls by a Gentile friend who used to give them wool, and they would knit sweaters, and the sweaters were sold, and they were not far from Gestapo headquarters, and this Gentile was really scared stiff if they ever get found out, they would all be executed. However, thank God the Americans liberated them, and they were there. And I brought her to her sister. She stayed with her about 4 or 5 weeks, and she got orders to go to the States. Meanwhile, in order to be able to do all this, my time, I had enough points to go back, so I had to enlist for 6 months in order to stay there, which I did. when I brought my wife to Brussels, I returned to my outfit, and I realized that no one was there that knew me. It had changed. All the old fellows were back. Once again, I had to go on charge of quarters because I wasn't going to sit there 6 months. And I stayed in charge of quarters, and I got my re-enlistment papers. I did what I had to do. The next day, I reported to the new captain, who was green. I says, what's going on? I think I had about 80 points in battlefield and so on. And he says, well, you shouldn't be here. And immediately expedited my return to the United States. My wife, meanwhile, went aboard the ship, the Zebulon B. Vance. That was in March, and she thought she would come to the States. She will meet people she does not know. She met my sister and so on. However, due to the fact that I was with so many points, they brought me back to the States immediately. I came to the States before she did. She did not know this. I was discharged in Fort Dix.
What date were you discharged?
I was discharged in March 1946. And I must have been discharged March 23rd, and she came to the States, I think, on the 29th. And I met her at the boat, and she never saw me in civilian clothes. She said, who's this? Oh, my goodness. And she was so happy. And when I brought her home, I remember like today, my mother was a widow. My brother-in-law had, by that time, left Monticello, and he became rabbi of a shul on 17th Street and 8th Avenue in Brooklyn. And they lived in Prospect Park Southwest, 202 Prospect Park Southwest. And of course, they took my wife in, they took me in, and my mother says, in Yiddish, she says, "Brengt a Mädel," she says, "Knock it, naked." What if she got a pair of torn bloomers? That's exactly what she said. And then here's $500, which was a fortune. And she made my sister go with her to Pitkin Avenue, and she bought her first real good coat and everything. In the interim, her brother-in-law, who was a tailor in Brussels, I gave him money, and I gave him yard goods, which I procured, and he made her first suit. She had it for many years. And then we were married here, and...
How did you support yourselves here? How did you support yourselves here?
When I came here, I started to look for a business, and this very good friend of mine, Jack Levine, told me he saw an ad in the Aguda paper advertising a store in Williamsburg, which at that time was Orthodox modern, not Hasidic like today. A hardware store, and he knew I was handy. He would come in, we'd go partners. He came there, bought the store. It wasn't really a hardware store. It had a few nails and a few bobby pins. In those days, they sold hair nets, and they had very little parts because of the war. And we bought the store, and then we started to work there. And I started to sell Venetians, window shades. I went to homes and so on and so forth. I always had an urge to return to school. I said to myself, I must one day go back to school. So we had the store for 3 years, and my partner said, you know, it's not big enough for both of us. Buy me out. So I said, okay. I bought him out. I paid him out, and he went to California. He wanted to go to California, and I started to work the store. And my cousin, who had found my cousin in Mauthausen, came to America, and I took him in, and he became my partner, and we bought another store, also in Williamsburg. Williamsburg started to change. The turnover became Hasidic, very Hasidic, and we worked hard. I worked from 7 in the morning till 11 at night. My wife became pregnant. We had our first child in 1947. Immediately after her giving birth, I had a nervous breakdown. Everything came back, my wounds and everything. I didn't speak to anybody. I didn't go to the store. And I went to the VA, and they sent me to a psychiatrist, and he worked with me for over a year, where he brought me out of it. I worked on him, he worked on me. When I was finished with him, he was making Kiddush Friday night. He became more traditional. And we became good friends. He's not here, he died. And I made up my mind I have to go back to school. So I took my equivalency in Queens College, and I passed it. And many years after that, I had my cousin, who was my partner, went to South America, so I took in one of the workers who had been a refugee. His name was Eugene Lichtenstein, and he became my partner in the store, and he ran one store, I ran the other, and after a while they built the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway between both our stores. So there was no need for two stores anymore. They had wiped out all our customers. So I closed up the one on Lee and Rodney, and I stayed in the original store. And I told him, I'm going to take you in as a partner. And I took him in as a partner. He was my partner in that store for 51 years. Eventually, I took in his sons to work for us, and I sold my share to his son, and he's now with his son in that store. The experiences in Williamsburg, as everybody knows, I have pictures downstairs of the Holocaust, of all the camps, and showing everything, the bones and the skeletons and the people down there, which was taken by the Army Photographic Service. I have copies of that. And one day, a competitor opened up his store a half block from me, and his main item was German crystal and stuff. And I put these pictures in the window with a letter saying to the people, you people have just come here, how can you buy German? They made the best gas chambers, I know that. They made the best killing machine. How can you buy German? But it did not help, of course. People are people, they want to live, and the crystal business became very big. He got so big that he gave up the retail outlet. He helped me when I said to him, why are you taking in housewares? You're putting me out. You have crystal and you have floor covering he took in. He says, no, it's a free country. I just got here. I'll do what I want. Okay. Forced me to take in floor covering, which became very lucrative and taught me a new line completely. And that was our life. Going back to my wife giving birth to my first daughter, Hindi, who was married now to Hindi Ulster, and I had a nervous breakdown the week after she gave birth, and it took about a year for me to recuperate. And we lived in Williamsburg on the third floor, and I started to look around for a little house, and I bought a house on East 19th Street in Flatbush for a fortune. It was $10,000 with $2,000 down, and I bought it under the GI Bill, and my wife gave birth to our son there, Abraham, who's an attorney today. My daughter was a school teacher. And 5 years later, she gave birth to our son, David, who was born with a rare condition that only Jewish children have. I don't know if it was mentioned, but it's known as dysautonomia. It's the autonomic nervous system that's affected. We didn't know what was wrong with the child. He had fever the first 2 years of his life. He was crying. He was this. We didn't know what to do. Finally, we took him to a pediatrician in Borough Park. He looked at him and he says, this child is crying without tears. I just read a book about the Riley-Day syndrome, also known as dysautonomia. There are 400 known children that have that, and they're all Jewish. It's a genetic. Here's a woman that I met in New York that we had no family relations still. Our genes go back to Avram Avinu, I guess. And we took him to Dr. Riley, who confirmed the fact that he has dysautonomia, and we had a job raising him. Very bright child, but we didn't. At his bris, I saw he didn't cry when they cut the bris, the mila. And then, after we learned about what he had, we realized he did not feel pain. He had no pain. He fell down, went broke a leg, he never knew it. It healed itself. Eventually, we had to take him to Houston, Texas for a spinal operation. He had scoliosis, and they put in Dr. Harrington himself, who was retired. I begged him to come and do it, and he did it. And he put him in the Harrington rod, stretched him about 4 inches. He went to the yeshiva at Kings Bay, then went to South Shore High School, couldn't take the hours of the Masifta, and then went to Adelphi Business Institute, and he worked. We have an accountant next door who loved him. He took him in, and he worked for him until he died. He expired at the age of 35. He had no control of his blood pressure, and the continuous banging of the blood pressure, one day it could be 200 over 100, and one day it can be 60 over 30. affected his kidneys, and we had to put him on dialysis, and we had him in the house for a year and a half on dialysis. And one morning, on a Shabbos morning, my wife and I went to shul. We said, Duvi, are you all right? Yes, she prepared food for him. He came down. When we came back from shul, we found the plates near the sink. He hadn't touched anything, but so I figured he just didn't feel like eating. I went up to see, and he was laying in bed. He had expired in his sleep. And we called that solar. They worked on him for hours, but nothing. That was Duvi. Duvi is remembered by everyone in our shul. And once a year on Purim, I send out 150, this year I sent out 144 to be exact, Shalach Monas packages to all my friends. In there, I put a little tchotchke. This year I put in a magnetic pie. And it says, Miriam and Irving Borenstein have given a donation in lieu of Hamantash and wine, and so on and so forth. And I slip in the story of the dysautonomia and an envelope. I sent in. Last year we raised $5,000 like that. It cost me personally about $1,000 to mail it and do anything, but I'm happy to do it. And that's about it. And that's my life.
When did you complete your education?
I went back to Brooklyn College after I got my, in 1984 I graduated Brooklyn College. I got my BA, and I went on for my master's in Wurzweiler, Yeshiva University, and I graduated in 1986.
Did you ever use that degree? Did you ever use that degree?
I never used it. I went to get a job, and I saw that if I do it, it has to be voluntary. I felt I'm using that degree all my life. I was more or less a social worker all my life because it's inbred. When I graduated Wurzweiler, I went back. I was still in business all this time. My partners were very nice. I worked at night, and they came in the morning. I had as a social worker, I had to do field work, but I specialized in geriatrics. So first year I worked with JASA. The second year I worked at the Daughters of Jacob in the Bronx, a nursing home. And I was 64 years old. And my greatest pleasure was when I had a client who was 90 years old, and he used to say to me, Sonny, come here. I was a young man, and he was so happy. And I appreciate my thesis is on the value of nursing homes and so on. And that was my educational part. I felt very happy about it.
How do you spend time now?
Well, until about 3 months ago, July 7th, 1997, I sold my store, which made it exactly 51 years that I had it to the day. I concentrated on a little real estate that I have. Also, I'm house chairman in the Flatbush Park Jewish Center, which I was president, treasurer, and vice president. And I'm vice president in the Crown Heights Yeshiva. And we're building an annex building there on the property of Flatbush Park Jewish, and I'm more or less supervising the building of that building as a volunteer.
What's your greatest accomplishment or achievement?
Finding my wife and marrying her. That was, as I said before, was a civic by on the schedule that I had for my bar mitzvah. It's Kisei. I went out to war. I found a bride. Her hair had been shorn off, unfortunately, by Amalek, and also the Pasha Zohar, which tells you, do not forget what Amalek did to you. Amalek being, in my eyes, the Germans, which Yamach Shema, I can say, which I never forgave for what they did, and never will. They did a job on the Jews, something that never happened in our history. And the more I read about it, the more I read the book by, I forget the title for a moment.
Goldhagen?
Yes, Goldhagen's book, German.
Hitler's Willing Executioners.
Yeah, Hitler's Willing Executioners, that's what it was. Right, and I saw exactly what I saw in these people. It's so true, everything he said, every one of them. And let me tell you, I saw it in the army. We had white boys Gentile, black boys, Gentile, that came to the camps. Some of them wept. They walked back out. They forgot they went with the Fräuleins, even though they were not allowed to at that time. But then again, some of the people that were liberated ended up with some of them. They went through hell. How could they do it? They married, and they thought they were buying security. When we lived in South Fifth Street, my wife and I, in the apartment house next door, there was a Jewish girl married to a Polak. And he used to beat the hell out of her. My wife used to hear her cry, and she said, that's what you get for going to a good. She couldn't visualize it, what he did, especially with Polak. That was the story.
When you think back to all you've seen through your life, what one issue or one image comes, repeats and haunts you?
The meeting of the Jews after the liberation. I've spoken at many schools to children in high schools in yeshiva. I was in Madison High School, and I spoke there. I spoke at, we have a Holocaust meeting every year in our center. I was a guest speaker there. I, in my wildest dream, could never visualize what these people, the Germans, did to our people, and for no reason. I couldn't imagine human beings. They're not human for what they did. And that's it. That is the most, and it more or less made me feel that I was right when I was a Zionist, that we need our own country, that we have to have our own flag. I knew the Rabbeim were against it. They're waiting for Mashiach, and I felt Mashiach is a little late.
Did you ever feel that you would be living in the time of Mashiach, that you would ever greet his arrival?
I personally always questioned that. To me, Mashiach, the word Mashiach means someone that has been anointed. It's not any individual. Kings were anointed, they became Mashiach. I mean, taking oil and pouring it on their head. And many times I have discussions with the rabbi. I said, had the Torah been written today, it wouldn't even mention a melech, a king, because they're nothing. It will be a president, and the president can be booted out. I never felt one man, any man, is greater than the next man, no matter what his standing in life is. Everyone had a past. So that was my idea. My children asked me, after what you saw, how come you picked religion and you took a religious girl? And I asked her, when I met her, do you believe in mikveh and things like that? And she was astonished, American soldier. I took it as a way of life, more so than, because you're bound to have your doubts when you see what you saw. But I said, this is a way of life, of respect, of bringing up a family, of a derech. And I told it to my grandchildren. Now I have, I know her 4 grandchildren. They're all good children. Some are more religious, some are a little less. However, I told them that's the only way. Because if you don't remember you're a Jew, they will remind you. And when they remind you, it's too late. And that was it.
How do you want to be remembered?
By everybody? I guess I want to be remembered as a nice guy. My wife says you always go out of your way to be a nice guy. I guess that's what I want to be, a nice guy. I visit people in the hospitals. I call if they're sick. I try. As a matter of fact, I don't have a beard now, but 5 months ago I had a little beard here, like Lenin. My Bobby used to call me Lenin. And there was a time when someone was very sick, and I visited them in Brookdale Hospital. I remember like today, and they wouldn't let anyone in. They wouldn't go right in, Rabbi. And when my rabbi came, who has no beard, he said, he's the rabbi. He says, the rabbi was here already. They wouldn't let him in. He called me on the phone. He said, Irving, you've got to take that beard off. Of course, he was killing him. That's the way it is.
What advice do you have for your children and grandchildren?
Well, they should go in true derech. They should be honest with themselves. and they should never forget they're Jewish. As I said before, if not, someone will come and remind them. And of course, they should continue their studies. My Anikel will be coming in hopefully tomorrow from Yerushalayim. He's been studying a year there in the yeshiva. My granddaughter's studying in Telz. That's my son's children. My daughter's children, Amy, is in Maryland, University of Maryland. She decided to take theater, which is it. And my grandson, who was my daughter's firstborn, his name is Asaf. He is in the computers. He worked for an attorney for 6 years, and he was supposed to go to law school, but he decided he prefers computers. And I said, God bless you. Just be honest, marry the right girl, and that's it.
We're going to end the tape now.
Okay.
What message would you now like to deliver to the world?
Well, the world, besides even some of the Jews, the world should be ashamed of what happened. The Vatican recently assumed some of the blame, but nothing what it should be. The world was quiet. The only one that did, surprisingly, take in and save some Jews was Japan, Denmark, and recently I've been reading about Bulgaria, with out of a million and millions of people. Of course, China at that time, they were busy themselves, they were being persecuted by the Japanese. But the French were terrible, just as bad. The Polacks and the Ukrainians, the Germans could not do what they did without the help of even the French, the Polish people, the Ukrainians, and sometimes the Russians themselves. The Russians killed many, many Jews. The world is not a place to be proud of. And the Jewish people gave the world what they have. The Einsteins, the doctors, the healing of the polio, the Salk vaccine, the cup. They gave them a Torah, they gave them a Gemara, Talmud, and the people did not want to learn. And to prove all that is what happened yesterday in Arkansas, where 2 children can kill other children. These children will be slapped on the hand. According to the Torah, they should be given a death sentence, 100%. They're young. They didn't know what they were doing, but we don't need them. And that should happen to anyone that puts other people to trial like that. This is the 3rd school that it happened at, and it will continue to happen until the people of this country and all other countries turn back to the ways of the Bible. Whether you believe it or not, the ways are good. It's good and bad, and they only give you good. And that's it.
Thank you.
Right. Wave to her, she'll wave to me. This is a picture of my father, Abraham Borenstein, who was in the United States Army in the First World War, 1918, I believe. He served for a few months and was honorably discharged. This is my father to the left in the back, Abraham Borenstein. My mother to the right of him, Sadie or Jenny Borenstein. My sister near my father, Miriam Borenstein, and that's myself sitting on a table, Irving Borenstein. This is Irving Borenstein, myself, about 2-3 months after I entered the Army. I was given my patch, that means I've been fully accepted into the anti-aircraft. If you notice, there's an AA on my left shoulder. Eventually, I wore that patch on my right shoulder because I had been assigned to a different division of the Army. That was the procedure in the Army. This picture is a picture of my headquarters battery of the 133rd Anti-Aircraft Gun Battalion. This picture was before we went overseas. Certain parts of it were white out because of the secrecy of the radar equipment that we had. I'm in the second row, about the center. My face is a little hidden by my sergeant, who sat down in front of me. I wasn't going to tell him to sit a little further, so it was just about a week before we shipped overseas. Marked June 1944.
What dates was this?
This was in, I believe we shipped out of Fort Dix, I think. I'm not sure. I don't recall really. We had just come back from Fort Bragg, and we were, it was Fort Bragg. They still had us in Fort Bragg then. I was showing her. Okay, this is a picture of my girlfriend, a fiancée at that time, in Fürth on the airfield, on a P-51, I believe it was. And I sat her on a wing, and I pulled my .45 to show her macho, and that was it. She had just began to realize what an American is. She called me a real American a cowboy, but she had never really seen a cowboy. She didn't know what a Bronzeville boy is. That's what it was. This is one of the survivors I met, one of the first survivors I met. He was in the striped clothing yet, and I took a picture of him.
What was his name?
I can't remember his name. It's really something that I met so many people at that time. They came running to me for this, for that, for addresses. Everybody had somebody. If I know Moshe in Brooklyn, how would I know Moshe or Chaim? If they had the second name, I tried to trace them down. There were many I did trace down. I have many letters here from the Rabbi's Chief Counsel, receipts for the Talesim and the Truman that I bought. We're not showing that. Okay. This document is our Tnoim, our engagement papers. In the Jewish rite, you have a Tnoim, and then you, before the wedding, it says Mazel Tov, and so on. It was handwritten by one of the survivors of the camp. I believe it was this Ezer Orlander who was a shochet, and he put in the appropriate sayings and the witnesses and so on. That's a dear piece of paper. It was done in Fürth. I purchased the cow from the Germans. He ritually slaughtered it, and we had a terrific dinner. There were quite a few people that joined us at that time. It was also my wife's birthday, the 13th of December, 1945. This is a copy, this is my Army discharge in the United States. It certifies the fact that I was honorably discharged. It shows the front of the discharge and also the back of the discharge. The back shows the battleship, the medals that I received. It also mentions the fact that I was expert in the rifle M1, and I also received a good conduct medal, which is very rare for a Bronzeville boy. That's about it. This is one of the most recent pictures of our family. Unfortunately, my son had died, and he is not in this picture. The top row is my grandson, Asaf Alster, my son-in-law, Aaron, and my granddaughter, Amy. Next to her is my granddaughter, Amanda, whose bat mitzvah it was at that time. My son, Avram Chaim Yosef, Abraham, and next to him is his son, Alec. On the bottom row, to my right, is my daughter, Hindi, myself, Irving Borenstein, my dear wife, Miriam, and next to her is my daughter-in-law, Sharon. Unfortunately, David was not around when we took this picture anymore. This is a picture of myself, Irving Borenstein, when I graduated the Wertzweiler School of Social Studies, the Yeshiva University, It's one of my achievements that I'm very proud and thankful to my wife that she let me go to school again. My mother didn't, and my wife insisted. So now she has a husband with a MSW, and I really put it to work. I'm nice to my wife, just like they taught us at school.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. This is my wife, Miriam Borenstein. I've told the story, I'll tell it again. I met her in Germany, in the camps, and we were married there, and then over here so my mother could come to the chuppah. And we had 3 children. One never passed away on us, but we have 2 beautiful children who gave us 4 beautiful Einekach. We're very proud of them, and I'm proud of my wife. She's been good to me for 52 years, and she's taken a lot of my Michigassen, which when you're born and brought up in Brownsville, you're bound to have some, especially she came from a foreign country. It was very hard. When I met her, she didn't understand any English, and I had to propose and speak to her and tell her, "Chab dir lieb" in Yiddish, and she thought I was whacked out, and the Jewish that I spoke, I remember like today, the first time I came into the room, I said, nimm mein coat and hang this in the closet. And they all looked at me as if I'm nuts, because the closet is a latrine overseas in Europe. And over here, they call it a closet, and that's a toilet. But to me, it was a closet where you hang it. They couldn't understand the Americans. But eventually, we got to know. I told them I would show them, bring them some movies. I would take them to the movies. Movies to them, they didn't know what it was. It was a kino. Movies, movies is death. We had enough movies, and so on and so forth. So we had our misunderstandings in language and communications, but the older we get, we're like whiskey and wine, the sweeter and better we get. I'm telling you that from the bottom of my heart. I really appreciate my wife for putting up with me. We're married now 52 years, and thank God I met her. I'm not happy we had a war and we had to lose all these Jews, but it was destined for me to meet her, as I mentioned before. Now, what my wife have to say.
I'm almost speechless over here, you know. How do I top that? But the only thing I can say that when we brought over my father from England, and he lived with us for about 3 years until he unfortunately died a violent death. Both my parents died violent deaths. And he made me, my father made me jealous, because I felt at times that he liked him more than he liked me. As soon as he got to know him, he was crazy about him. And naturally, I loved him a lot. I always will, but we had our ups and downs. Like, you know, we came from 2 different worlds, and we had I had a hard time getting adjusted, but I learned to understand him, and I had so much to say before, and now I'm almost a loss for words.
You can find.
That's right. But if nothing else, I know that I always respected him. Because you mentioned before that he is one of the kind. You truly told the truth, because my husband is the kindest person you ever want to meet. I say to him, people call him for advice, older people than himself. Call him, Irving, what do you think of that? What should I do? How should I do? And he never stops giving time to causes, and he is so good, he's almost too good to the whole world. So I suppose if he's so good to everybody else, so how could he be bad to me? So that's that's my little story about my dear husband.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you
it was a
very much.
pleasure.
Thank you to you.
That's it. We should have nachas from our children,
That's right.
and the world should be peaceful. Are we still on?
I always say at the candle lighting, all the sick ones should have a refuah shalema, and there should be peace in Israel and in the whole world. This is my prayer by every candle lighting, from the outset till till I'll die.